This is Without Conscience, The Disturbing World of the Psychopaths Among Us by Robert D. Hare, PhD. This is a little bit more mainstream material than my usual diet of books here, but I got this a few years ago. I think this was referenced in something else I was reading at the time. Again, this is another good argument for always going to the bibliography of whatever you're reading and see that if you're reading a good book, anything nonfiction that has, always check the source materials because you can find some really good gold in there. And I think that's how I found this particular book, but not sure entirely. But I got this and read most of it on flying to and from California a couple of years ago. So this is exactly what it says. It's basically a breakdown of psychopathic behavior, and this was written, I believe, in '93. Yes, copyright '93. This edition was published in '99, and I say that the publishing date of this is interesting in light of kind of the part of the conclusion of this. Overall, this is a pretty basic treatment and easy to read treatment of just understanding psychopathic behavior. That's, again, it's one of those titles, kind of like narcissism, that gets thrown around a lot, especially in social media. And it's important to understand what real, actual psychopathy or whatever is, and not just hyperbole when somebody goes, wow, that dude's a psycho, or that guy's a psychopath. This does a really good job of explaining, in layman's terms, psychopathic behavior and how to spot that through a lot of different anecdotes. And what a lot of you will appreciate is there's a section in here. I've dog-eared a lot, but one thing that when I was going back through today, looking for this book, one thing that jumped out at me was the corporate psychopath. This, it kind of makes me wonder if this is where John Ronson got his idea for his book, The Psychopath Test, because in that section, it gives a kind of a case study of a psychopath in this corporate environment. And what's interesting about this is the guy's co-workers and his direct superior are all fed up with this guy and want him out. But they can't get rid of him because the upper levels of their corporate structure see all of his behavior as actual beneficial, at least on paper, to them from their vantage point. Say they see this as actually good qualities for a corporate, team builder kind of person. So that alone, that's an interesting section in here. But there's lots of good. Probably the best thing about this book is the good author here breaks down a lot of good situations into anecdotal accounts of different cases to give you an idea. And a lot of these are cases that will resonate with you, that you'll see, oh, wow, that reminds me of that person. And reading this, I came to the very uncomfortable conclusion that there were several people I had dealt with, some that I had actually had a decent amount of respect for, especially in my younger years, that had been just straight up psychopaths. And sometimes when those relationships go south, you blame yourself and go, man, why did that happen? And when you read stuff like this and you start to see kind of a lot of times the reason those relationships go south is because the psychopath is done with you. You have served your purpose. So it's not so much that you have wronged them as much as they're done and they're moving on. So lots of good information in here. I'm trying to see if there's any other. He brings up the DSM-4 at the time of this writing. I think it was the DSM-4. Talks about how there's not a straight up classification for psychopathy, that at least for adolescents, that there's ADHD is one. He says there's three that kind of combined create a psychopath in an adolescent. Is ADHD, conduct disorder and oppositional defiant disorder. And oppositional defiant disorder, that's one that I dealt with a lot. I worked at a group home many moons ago, and that was one you saw a lot of oppositional defiant disorder. That was pretty standard. So in conclusion, I want to just wrap this up, keep this fairly simple here. One of the things I found interesting about this is he really struggles towards the end of the book trying to decide or how to present the idea of reforming a psychopath. And obviously that's not something that can be an external thing. The person has to change, not you. And he gives some good advice for avoiding these types of people and how to spot them in the wild, so to speak. So there's some good knowledge there. I personally am of the mind that I don't think anyone is born into a type of which they cannot escape. I think everyone has the ability to change, be it on their deathbed. I think the potential for human change and growth is huge. I think even a lot of the crazy individuals running the country right now, I think they're not beyond redemption. They are all people who could in fact change. So that said, back to the book, there was a couple of other things I wanted to point out. One of them was talking about the psychopaths using their stare. It talked about how many psychopaths and victims of psychopaths, in some cases murderers, people who had been victims of murderous psychopaths, talked about their eyes, that they had a very hypnotic kind of gaze and hypnotic kind of stare, very penetrating stare, and also kind of a soulless look about them. That in some cases, in one account they give in here, where their stare would not match their other outward behavior. So regardless of their general attitude at the time or whatever their expression was, their stare remained the same. And I've encountered that after I read this, and especially when I started really digging into hypnosis and what's something called the hypnotic stare. I was amazed at some of the people who would try that try this very intimidating stare on you, where they have this very penetrating stare. And I actually have one of my magic books, as in performance magic, not occult magic, actually mentions this as well. And it is called the hypnotic stare. And they say that, to do it to unnerve spectators or whatever. And they talk about staring right at this point, or what would be typically referred to as their third eye, right here. And that is a very unnerving, penetrating gaze. And I would imagine that that's a lot of what some of these guys have learned to do through intuition, if probably not through training, but just learning that. Because the interesting thing is, I found if I did that back to some of the customers and people I've worked with that have done that, they will stop. They'll back down really quick. It's like this weird game of chess that they're playing with you through their vision. And when you do it back to them, they don't really know how to respond, and they'll look away, and it's like they've been busted doing something. So something fun to try, and I'm curious if any of you have ever experienced that. But if you ever do encounter that, just stare right back, right here, and you get some interesting results sometimes. So I'm just going to read verbatim his last, one of the last little comments in this that I think towards the end, towards this conclusion here. It's the problem with dog earring so much in here. There's a lot to sort through. Okay, here we go. This is from page 177. And again, I think this is very telling in light of, this was written in 1993. So this is almost 30 years old. And this is kind of the tail end of him kind of predicting where he sees some of this going for society. And after reading a lot of this, I'm inclined to think, much like narcissism, I think social media really heightens a lot of behavior disorders. And I think psychopaths may not necessarily be created by social media, but they certainly enjoy it as just a playground of victims. Excuse me. So I think that's a really important thing to remember, that there are a lot of people that you can wind up engaging with in social media that are just straight up predators. And once you realize that, it's time to sever contact and pull back. And I think that's probably the most important lesson from all this, is to realize when you encounter someone with these exhibiting these kinds of behavioral traits and patterns, the best avenue for you is to get away. There's not a mental judo or physical judo way to work your way out of it. People who are professional, unabashed liars will always have the upper hand. So the best thing to do is get away from them. So again, he's talking about the societal implications of kind of where he saw things going in circa 1993. And he says, if, as I believe, our society is moving in the direction of permitting, reinforcing, and in some instances actually valuing some of the traits listed in the psychopathy checklist, traits such as impulsivity, irresponsibility, lack of remorse, and so on, our schools may be evolving into microcosms of a, quote, camouflage society where true psychopaths can hide out, pursuing their destructive, self-gratifying ways and endangering the general student population. Troubling indeed are the implications of the silence of those 20 Canadian youths who knew of a murder, knew the identity of the murderer, but whatever their reasons, told no one. They suggest that our society may be not only fascinated, but increasingly tolerant of the psychopathic personality. Even more frightening is the possibility that, quote, cool but vicious psychopaths will become twisted role models for children raised in dysfunctional families or disintegrating communities where little value is placed on honesty, fair play, and concern for the welfare of others. And holy cow, that's if that's not prophetic, I don't know what is. And this guy obviously was not taking into account social media, but you see so much now that has so much in pop culture that has steered people away from personal responsibility. So many things are, you're born that way, or this is a path you have no control over. This is just your impulse and you need to follow that. I've seen more destructive behavior enabled under the guise of being your authentic self than I've ever seen before. So really, really interesting stuff there. And that, I'll close with just this last little bit of rambling here. I feel like we've hit a point in Western culture that, and those of you who follow Dave McGowan's work, like Weird Scenes in the Canyon and Program to Kill, that part about these people looking up to cool psychopaths should really hit home, because that's exactly what McGowan was saying in not so many words of basically we're propping up psychopaths as examples for youth, and psychopaths that are presented in such fashion that consequences for their behavior are detached from their actual behavior. So where cause and effect have been so effectively distanced from each other that when you do see the consequences of someone's behavior, that's seen as maybe society is just rejecting this person for who they really are, rather than maybe this is a logical consequence of their behavior. So on that note, I feel like we're kind of at this weird point in Western civilization where kind of like a carnival that's come into town. And when I say a carnival, I want to make that distinct from like a theme park or a state fair or a county fair. Traveling carnivals always had kind of a seedy element to them, and they were very predatory. They came into little towns and would try to just fleece the town for as much money as they could, and then they packed up and went off to the next place. And that was their MO. And if you were an older member of the population in the town, you saw the carnival for what it was. You saw these people coming into town as predators, and you might still go and have a little bit of fun and ride a ride or something, but you also knew what you were dealing with, and you wanted to make sure make sure you still got your wallet when you left. It's almost like now, as Western culture has hit a point where the carnival has come to town, and because we fail to realize it's a carnival, we haven't run it off. And the carnies have now taken up places in our city council and our government, and just like regular old-fashioned carnies, they don't know when to stop. They just keep taking and taking and taking until they deplete all the resources. And they'll keep doing that until they get run out of town. And I'm not making an argument for violent revolution or anything like that. I'm just saying we're in a position now where we have allowed the carnies to overstay their welcome. And we are paying dearly for that. And again, that carny thing goes back to, of course, psychopathy. But anyway, hope you enjoyed that somewhat rambling review of Without Conscience by Robert D. Hare, PhD, The Disturbing World of the Psychopaths Among Us. Do recommend this, again, if you're into, especially if you research any ritual abuse topics or anything like that, or just organized criminal activity. This is a good one just to get a feel for pinning down those behavior patterns. And again, if nothing else, just protecting yourself from that and having a good realistic worldview of how people behave.